The crowd's cheers escalated as a circle closed in. Shadows cast from flickering lights dancing around Sentinel. He held himself ready, his eyes locked on the hulking mutant in the center, refusing to show an ounce of hesitation. His mission was clear: to give his team the precious seconds they needed to escape. Sentinel stepped into the center of the ring as he assessed his opponent. The mutant towered over him, muscles rippling under taut, scarred skin, eyes dazzling with wild gleam. Sentinel's heartbeat slowed as he took a deep, centering breath, steadying his stance. This mutant was built for brutality, but Sentinel had skill, experience, and a purpose beyond himself. He raised his fists like a boxer and let the monster come. The crowd erupted as the mutant champion lunged forward, a beastly roar punctuating his swing. Sentinel dodged, ducking just in time as a massive fist hurtled past his head, close enough to ruffle his hair. He countered with a swift jab to the mutant's ribs, the impact solid but barely phasing the larger opponent. The mutant swung again, relentless, and this time a blow connected, hard and unyielding, slamming Sentinel back against the feral crowd. Hands shoved him roughly, sending him staggering back into the ring. He felt a sharp sting in his side, but he pushed it down, narrowing his focus on the brute before him. Gritting his teeth, he prepared for the mutant's next assault. As the mutant closed in again, Sentinel stayed light on his feet, weaving and dodging to avoid the worst of the hits. A powerful swipe came down, and he ducked low, coming up with an uppercut to the mutant's jaw. It forced the mutant back a step, but he only snarled, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip with a mocking grin. Sentinel's fists tightened. This was going to be a test of endurance. The mutant roared again and lunged, swinging in wild arcs, each strike full of unrestrained strength. Sentinel dodged, timing his movements, darting in close to deliver quick, calculated blows to the mutant's vulnerable points. He targeted the mutant's ribs, abdomen, and the side of his knee, his strikes aimed at wearing the mutant down over time. But the mutant fought back with relentless aggression. A powerful punch connected with Sentinel's shoulder, sending him stumbling. The impact radiated pain through his arm, but he forced himself to ignore it, regaining his footing. The crowd was a deafening wall of noise, the chants and roars spurring on the mutant's fury. Sentinel's breaths grew ragged, but he maintained his focus. Each time he was pushed back, the crowd shoved him back in. They were out for blood, and so was he. Go, he thought, barely registering the black-clad figures fleeing into the distance. Get the hell out of here. Get to safety. He sidestepped the next swing, dropping low and sweeping his leg in a quick, practiced move that took the mutant's knee out from under him. The giant staggered, just off balance enough for Sentinel to deliver a quick 1-2 punch to his face and ribs. The mutant grunted, reeling back, but he wasn't down yet. Again and again, Sentinel struck, using every ounce of his training to stay just out of the mutant's reach while landing hit after hit. His knuckles throbbed, his muscles ached, and his breathing grew labored. He was not as young as he once was, didn't have the endless endurance of his 20s, but he refused to let up. He could see the toll his attacks were taking. The mutant's movements were slowing, his breath heavy, his swings less controlled. Then, the crowd's fervor reaching a fever pitch, Sentinel seized his opening. Ducking under a sluggish punch, he rose up with all his remaining strength, slamming his elbow into the mutant's nose with a sharp, decisive crack. The impact reverberated through his elbow all the way into his teeth. The mutant's head snapped back, dazed, and Sentinel followed up with a powerful hook to the jaw, then drove a knee into his abdomen. The mutant gagged, staggering. His hulking form wavered unsteadily before he finally crumbled to the ground, the fight beaten out of him. Sentinel took a step back, breathing hard, bruised and battered, but triumphant. He stood tall, his eyes defiant, as he faced the mutant crowd, daring any of them to challenge him. And when he looked into the crowd, all he saw were the distorted faces of strangers. His people had made it out. Tasting his own blood, Sentinel grinned. Finally understanding Sentinel's ruse, scorn pushed through the crowd. "You think this is over? There's no reward for your victory, soldier. So what if your team escaped? You can take the punishment." Scorn didn't get to finish before the entire lower level of Krater Station shook, an ominous rumbling from somewhere deep within. And this time, it didn't stop. The geothermal plant was about to go critical. Sentinel laughed. The timing couldn't have been better. "If you hurry, you might be able to stop that. Better stop wasting time here with me." Scorn turned towards the direction of the plant, his sneer replaced by a dawning panic. After a breath, he snapped out of his stupor, barking to his people. "Move! Get to the plant, now!" Sentinel didn't tell them that there was no way to stop the explosion, not this late in the game. All they were doing was running toward their grave. The rumbling beneath his feet grew stronger. He knew he had time to make it out, but he was going to have to push himself to the very brink. He grabbed his discarded helmet, bit down the pain, put one foot in front of the other, and ran. His lungs protested the show of cardio after the long, drawn-out fight, but he ignored it. Each minute brought him closer to his goal. Before he rounded the last corner that would take him to the stairwell, the rumble beneath his feet became a tremor, pulsing up through the walls. Krater Station had nearly reached its breaking point. "Push harder. Go faster." His breaths came ragged, but he kept one thought at the forefront of his mind. Get back to the team. Beaten and bruised or not, he still had a job to finish. Reunite with the team and get them all out of there, alive. Hawkeye tightened his grip on Raptor's arm, feeling the strain in his own shoulder as Raptor stumbled, legs barely holding him up. Jester had Raptor's other side, his jaw clenched with the effort, and together they hauled their injured squad mate through the maintenance tunnel. It was the last obstacle they had to face before they were on the surface again. One last push. Jester kept up a steady stream of encouragement to Raptor, but Hawkeye didn't bother. He knew the other man was too far gone in his own pain to register what the demolition expert was saying, so he didn't waste his breath. The sniper was carrying more weight anyway, with a variety of Exo's most important parts in a makeshift pack on his back. They had barely entered the tunnel when their comms crackled, and Sentinel's voice came through, strained and breathless.
"Almost. Do you?"
His tone was raw with exhaustion, and he was still inside of the plant. Hawkeye gave himself a single second to feel the frustration of it all. and then he exhaled slowly. "I'll meet him," he told the rest of the team, coming to a stop and pulling his pack off his back. He held onto it a beat longer, reluctant to let go, but forced himself to release it. Aegis seemed almost startled when he handed it over to her, but she didn't complain, shouldering it without a word. "Don't lose this." To her credit, she didn't question him. "I won't." Tempest took his place on Raptor's other side. The height difference not ideal, but they were out of options. Turning without another word, Hawkeye jogged back through the tunnel in search of Sentinel. Jester had been forced to breach the door, and it was a wide-open wound in the structure as he passed from the tunnel back into the station. Finally, a limping figure emerged from the dimness ahead. Hawkeye was relieved. The commander was bruised and battered, but stubbornly moving forward. Blood stained one side of his face, and his breathing was labored, but he waved off any concern before Hawkeye could even show it. Not that he had planned to. "Good?" he asked simply, and Sentinel barked a rough laugh. "Not gonna lie, I've been better. Let's get the hell out of here." Hawkeye gave a tight nod, not willing to waste any more time. Together they pressed forward, each second urgent as the station shook more and more. He didn't know if it was just the effort of the run to find Sentinel, but Hawkeye swore it was getting hotter by the second. The maintenance tunnel entrance was in sight now, a faint glimmer of light marking their way out, only a short distance ahead of them. But then, the ground convulsed beneath. The entire area vibrated with a deep, guttural rumble, growing in strength. The walls of Krater Station trembled, as if they were in pain. It was their very last warning. An explosion ripped through the silence, far from them, but powerful enough to send dust and fragments of concrete raining from the ceiling above. It nearly knocked them off their feet, and the two men braced themselves on each other to keep from falling. "We've got to go," Sentinel gasped, voice barely audible over the deep, echoing roar. They stumbled forward, feet barely catching the ground as everything seemed to shift around them. Hawkeye gripped Sentinel's shoulder, practically dragging him, every bit of his focus locked on the tunnel's exit. The force of the blast grew, and the structure strained under the force of it. The muted rumble of the plant became something violent and thunderous, the air filled with the sound of falling rock, twisting metal, and shattering glass. They were too close. He didn't know if they would make it, but they had to. Hawkeye could hear the cracks of pillars breaking as his mind switched, cold, clinical, and hyper-focused. He slipped fully into his sniper mentality, emotions gone, each thought crystallizing around one goal: get Sentinel out. His grip was almost painful as he grabbed the commander by the arm and forced the both of them to move. He quickly calculated each movement, each shift of weight, blocking out the deafening blasts and debris falling like dust rain from above. Scanning the corridor ahead, he assessed every possible collapse point and chose the clearest line to safety. The chaos, the trembling ground, even Sentinel's labored breathing, everything became background noise, mere details against his laser focus. A large slab of ceiling crumbled just in front of them, blocking part of the tunnel. Without hesitation, Hawkeye pulled Sentinel into a crouch, sidestepping it with precision and guiding him around the fallen debris. Sentinel stumbled, but Hawkeye caught him, barely pausing, his own body moving instinctively to brace against Sentinel's unsteady weight. The tremors grew, but Hawkeye ignored the immediate fear, tuning it out to process only what was critical. Walls cracked beside them, and he adjusted their path in microseconds, leading Sentinel just out of reach of falling rubble. Another section of the ceiling broke away, and they ducked under it, narrowly avoiding the concrete blocks that fell, shattering against the floor like bombs. 10 more steps, 1 more dodge, and they were out, finally, inside of the maintenance tunnel. Hawkeye didn't let up the pace until they were far enough from the station that the ground under their feet was finally still. In slow increments, he came back to himself. It was going to be a long walk. Sentinel was clearly done with running, but he had accomplished his task, and Hawkeye let himself enjoy the warm satisfaction of success, at least for the moment. They walked the rest of the way out, no longer fearing for their lives, but still anxious to meet up with the rest of the team. The exit of the tunnel came into view, a rectangle of light dead ahead. When they exited Krater Station back onto the surface, the daylight was a hard, gray silver. The sudden brightness and chill of the fresh air hit Hawkeye, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. But when they did, it was clear their moment of peace was over. The sight before them was frantic, the rest of Ares battered and tense. Raptor lay unmoving on the stony ground, Aegis performing chest compressions, while Tempest knelt to the side, ready to take over when the medic grew tired. "He collapsed as soon as we made it outside," Tempest explained, sounding hollow. Nearby, Jester paced, his voice urgent over the comms coordinating the extraction. His heart pounded, the dull thud clearing away the last of the detachment from his mind. The urgency around him taking over, whether he wanted it to or not. Sentinel was at Aegis's side now, Tempest taking over compressions as the medic spoke fiercely to the Major, while pulling a long, wicked-looking syringe from her pack. She didn't ask, simply told Sentinel what she was going to do, but it was clear that she was still seeking confirmation that her next actions were the right ones. "I'm going to inject adrenaline into his heart. There's a significant chance of permanent brain damage if I do, but if I don't, do it." Sentinel's voice was steady and sure, and it was what Aegis needed. She knelt, and Tempest moved back. Aegis filled the syringe from a small vial, the movement practiced yet somehow fragile. Sucking in a bracing breath, she jammed the needle into the still man's chest with enough force to penetrate the muscle, and pushed the plunger down. Every eye fixed on Raptor, each holding their breath, waiting. His body jerked once, and then his mouth fell open as he sucked in an unaided breath. Aegis's fingers were at his neck, and a shudder of relief ran through her when she found the pulse. Raptor didn't wake up, but his pulse remained steady. Ares pulled themselves together and waited for extraction. It wasn't long before the distant hum of helicopter blades could be heard, a welcome sound. As the helicopter drew near, Hawkeye focused on the sky. He had waited days in a sniper's nest before, without food, barely moving, and still, the exhaustion he felt then was the most drastic he had ever experienced. He didn't know what it was, but as the chopper landed and the crew helped them load Raptor onto a stretcher, an odd sense of unease came over him, but he shook it off, gathered the pack that contained Exo, and boarded alongside the rest of Ares. As Tempest settled into the helicopter seat, the relief she initially felt, knowing that they're finally heading home, should have been a comfort. but there was a heaviness she couldn't shake. A dread lurking beneath the surface that grew stronger as they lifted away from Krater Station, leaving the ruins of the place behind. She tried to dismiss it, convincing herself it was just a reaction to the mission's intensity, the pressure catching up to her. But it clung to her, a weight in her chest that refused to fade. Only a short distance away from Krater, the helicopter began to circle down to rendezvous with Umbral's medical team. The rest of Ares was going into a short quarantine, but Raptor needed immediate medical attention. They met the second chopper in a grassy field where a small group of medics surround a stern, white-coated figure. It wasn't until the doors are pulled open that she recognized the man, Dr. Howard Brighton. It strikes her as odd. He wasn't a medic, but an exobiologist. Then she remembered Hawkeye mentioning him as the person to call to get Raptor pulled out before everything went to shit. She was used to being left in the dark when it came to Umbral's machinations. Sometimes, though, they just hit uncomfortably close to home. Sentinel argued with the exobiologist when he was told he wasn't allowed to travel with his second-in-command. It surprised her when Sentinel stood down, but the look on his face told her that Brighton's victory was hard-won. Carefully, they unloaded Raptor and transferred him over. Brighton motioned to Aegis, and the two spoke for a long period of time. The exobiologist's scarred face going pale from whatever the medic was relaying. Then, the doors of the medical chopper were being closed, and they watched as Raptor was separated from them. Tempest remembered Svalbard, Raptor's flesh slipping as the radiation ate him alive from the inside out. Cypher in a body bag. Raptor coming back, changed somehow. She remembered, and the dread grew in her chest like a dark flower. Sentinel and Aegis were speaking outside the chopper, leaving just her, Hawkeye, and Jester within. "Hawkeye," she started. "Why Dr. Brighton? He isn't exactly standard field personnel." Hawkeye unsurprisingly ignored her, but she didn't miss the twitch of his eyebrow. She doesn't notice Jester's attention sharpening, and he keeps his eyes averted. She tries again, her tone sharper, but as she studied Hawkeye, she realized that something was wrong. His face is drawn, angry even. She had no illusions that he would be an open book of sharing with her, but she got the distinct feeling he wasn't ignoring her to be a prick like usual. It was because he couldn't tell her. She dropped the subject. Once they were back in the air, Jester tried to break the tension. "So, I know I'm not the only one that saw the beginning of Sentinel's fistfight, right?" He elbowed the Major, who gave him a withering look. "Damn good job, boss. I wish we could have seen the whole thing." Sentinel gave a small, tired grin, rubbing his bruised knuckles. "Just goes to show. Old man's still got some fight in him." Tempest forced a smile, but her gaze drifted to the window, watching clouds blur by as they headed back. Her thoughts lingered on Raptor, and she wondered if he has any fight left himself. They all go, unhappily, into quarantine for 48 hours once they arrive back at home base. From outside of their individual pods, Umbral's best and brightest monitor them for any signs of contamination from Krater Station. It's standard procedure for biological threats, but it gives Tempest a lot of unwelcome time to think. If she let her mind wander for too long, she sees them loading Raptor's body into that medical chopper over and over again, and that feeling of disturbance blooms again in her chest. She spent her downtime training instead, until she's positive she never wants to do another push-up in her life, but at least it exhausted her enough to sleep. Raptor never arrives in the quarantine pods. His absence looms over them like a storm cloud. After 2 days, they're released and sent to be debriefed. Instead of the normal, dull, clinical rundown of the mission, they're immediately greeted by a few Umbral agents in crisp black suits who proceed to commend them all on a job well done. They're praised for managing a high-stakes mission with multiple, catastrophic, unexpected threats. Exo is set to be fully repaired within days. They managed to get all the essential parts out that made Exo uniquely Exo. Aegis' samples were incredibly useful, and despite the collapse, Umbral would still be able to excavate the station and reach the geothermal energy source without the threat of all the now buried mutants. All in all, a great success. "That's why you're the best," the agents said. "That's why Ares is one of our top teams." Ares barely reacts to the praise. Something is going unsaid, and they all know what subject is being avoided. Where the hell is Raptor? Then the hammer comes down. The agent giving their debrief pauses before delivering the news, his expression turning somber. "There's something else," he begins, voice heavy. "Raptor. He didn't make it. He passed away from his injuries during treatment with Dr. Brighton." The words hit Tempest like a physical blow. The dread she'd been carrying finally surfacing in full force, settling into a laden weight in her chest. She felt her stomach twist, her pulse quicken as she tried to process the news, but the shock was overwhelming. The news rolled through the team like thunder. Tempest didn't even register standing, but before her brain can even catch up, she'd kicked her chair over. Aegis was silent, white as a sheet, failure settling over her like a mourning veil. Sentinel red-faced was on his feet. He's yelling something at the agents. Tempest's ears are ringing too loudly to hear what he's saying. Violence is roaring inside of her, but then someone was grabbing her arm. It was Hawkeye, dragging her out of the room with an iron grip. Jester was doing the same for Sentinel. She fought the sniper like a scalded cat, but he was unmoved, even when her fist connects with his jaw. He all but throws her into the hallway, and when she tries to push past him to go back in, he stops her, 2 hands on her shoulder. But it wasn't even about getting answers now. Tempest could barely think, barely breathe, and fucking Hawkeye wouldn't move. Then she found the words. "Someone needs to get Aegis." Hawkeye's expression flickered, only for a beat, before he gives her a small shove backwards. "I'll get her." She doesn't trust him, but she lets him go anyway. It's Sentinel that finally brings Aegis out, 1 hand on her shoulder. She's expressionless, an empty husk. Where Tempest is filled with a furious fire, she can tell that it's a desolate wind inside of the medic, and nothing more. Jester, his lips pale with shock, is the first to speak. "Are they lying? I mean, after Svalbard." Sentinel holds up a hand before he can finish. "No. If we're being told he's dead, then he's dead to us. This was not... He pauses, swallowing hard, eyes red. This was not a failing on anyone's part but mine. Every soul on this team is my responsibility. Every death is mine to carry. Don't any of you dare to disrespect me by carrying my burden. There was vitriol in the last few words, but she knew it wasn't for them. It was for everything else. For his loss. For their loss. Tempest thought of the small, featureless gray stone marker in a well-maintained field 2 miles from base that read, Ivan Kozlov, and how they all knew there was nothing but dirt beneath it. That Umbral owned them even after death, gave them no dignity, wouldn't even return their bones to the earth. The truth of it was so bitter on her tongue. Grief hovered, ready to set into her. But not yet. Not yet. Finally, Sentinel, with 1,000,000 words in his chest left unsaid, told them, "Go home. We'll talk. Soon. Tempest, please walk with Aegis." Then, layered with 1,000 meanings, Nathaniel Delacroix said, "I'm so sorry, everyone." Ari took Alicia by the hand, which was ice cold, and led her away from the rest of them. James watched the women go until Felix laid a hand on his shoulder, and the 2 men walked away. Sentinel waited until he was alone to lean against the sterile white hallway wall and slide down until he was sitting, head in his hands. He said his final apologies in the privacy of his own mind. "Roderick, I'm so damned sorry."